The Obry Project presents, However, Episode Number 1, Christian Persecution by Jonathan Machtemes. If you grew up in a church, or if you pay attention to Christian culture and history, you know that there's a tradition and present claim of Christians being persecuted for their faith. Starting with the New Testament and Jesus himself, we see a steady stream in Christian literature of brutalization and death over nothing more than believing in and following Jesus. There is the abuse of the apostles in the book of Acts by way of beatings and imprisonment, the stoning of Stephen, the death of James, the general persecution of Christians in Judea, and the many beatings and imprisonments of Paul. And let's not forget John, exiled to Patmos. Then there's the prolonged history recounted in Fox's Book of Martyrs, from imperial Rome tossing Christians to the lions, on down to papal Rome burning Protestants, to the pagans of Europe and abroad killing the Christ follower in countless ways. The record seems to clearly reflect the tremendous spiritual bias demonstrated by non-Christians against Christians for eons. Today, outlets like Voice of the Martyrs, the World Christian Encyclopedia, and even the Pope provide a constant stream of publications, emails, speeches, and website informations regarding claims of horrible persecutions of Christians abroad. Even the U.S. Department of State and the U.K.'s Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs document what appears to be prolonged persecutions, or at least dwindling numbers of Christians in foreign lands. Based on all this data, it would seem that any Christian would be more than justified in claiming that Christianity and Christians experience possibly the worst treatment via persecution of any religion either now or in the past. These reports of persecution only seem to bolster and sustain the great credibility and power of this ages-old, undying faith. However, if any of us in first world Western countries look around us and pay attention to Christianity and Christians, do we see any sign of any of these claims whatsoever? The answer is a resounding no. We see nothing of the sort, not even anything remotely close. What we see instead is a church on every corner, and over 90% of those churches are 501c3 nonprofits, which makes things very easy in the sense of the churches getting bank loans, tax breaks, and other nonprofit government benefits. That doesn't sound like persecution. We see Protestant, Catholic, and other various sectarian denominations with innumerable daycares, primary and secondary schools, and even abundant colleges and seminaries. Ever heard of Notre Dame, Brigham Young, Moody Bible Institute, Dallas Theological Seminary, Wheaton College, California Baptist Institute, Indiana Wesleyan College, Baylor University, Oral Roberts University, or Biola University? But are there any predominant Christian universities in Europe? Well, how much time do you have? Because just as in America, Europe, South Africa, Australia, Canada, and other Western colonial settings are bursting at the seams with Christian colleges, schools, institutions, and protections, and all well-funded. Russia has St. Petersburg Christian University. France has Lille Catholic University. The Netherlands has Cornerstone College. Belgium has Leuven University. And then there's the South African Theological Seminary in, yes, South Africa, as well as a number of other Christian institutions enjoyed in this African country, all in addition to the fact that the number of Christian institutions in Canada, Australia, and the UK are entirely unreasonable for such a persecuted class of people. At this point you may say, but the media and culture certainly do persecute Christians in the West. But how are we now defining persecution? Is Hollywood and NBC hiring bands of thugs to go out and beat and imprison your children in the middle of their Sunday school snack time? Is Stephen King and John Irving sponsoring weapons programs for all the militant anti-Christians out there? Derision and criticism aren't persecution. They are derision and criticism. And unless the Western Christian isn't paying attention, the media and pop culture take shots at rednecks, good old boys, and hard-right activists with just as much vigor as they do towards Christians, if not more. Media and pop culture, in fact, deride Nazis far more than Christians. Are the Nazis now a persecuted minority? But then you protest, things are just a little better nowadays than in the past, when Christians were definitely harmed and killed for their faith. But honestly, were you there? Did you see it? Who actually saw and recorded these past brutalities? Were they Christian historians? If not, are they historical documents guarded and proliferated by Christian scholars and institutions? And if not, are we talking about documents that are entirely beyond reproach? Do all scholars agree on their veracity? The plain truth is, the historical persecution of Christians is a claim based on either hotly debated documents and or accounts written by, guarded by, and proliferated by Christians. And all are too far removed into the past for anyone, especially you, the slave class listener, to say with certainty one way or another about them. So then you may say, but there are still Christians being persecuted and killed all over the world today. While anyone even quasi-informed on the subject would have to respond with, no, I'm afraid not. There are people apparently brutalized and killed in countries far away from unbiased observers from the first world. Did you know that the majority of the alleged Christian persecution and death rates reported by the World Christian Encyclopedia, the Holy See, and Voice of the Martyrs occur in countries embroiled in conflicts, often with professed Christians on both sides of the conflicts? This fact entirely changes the reason why most of these people are being harmed and dying. But that doesn't seem to get in the way of a good story. And as for the alleged bombing of churches, Christian beatings, and Bible confiscations go, plenty of other buildings in these countries get bombed. Plenty of non-Christians get beaten, raped, and killed, and plenty of other books and personal items get taken all the time in faraway, distant lands, and none of those things have anything to do with Jesus. Then finally you insist, but we have the New Testament itself, the apostles, and the blessed passion of the Lord Jesus Christ as our great testimony of Christian suffering. And at the risk of being redundant, I would ask you, who wrote those books? Were they atheists, Nazis, pagans, Muslims? Furthermore, there isn't a shred of proof that any of those alleged people existed or that those alleged events occurred. And before you start citing establishment historical sources that appear to back up the claims of the New Testament, you really need to look at those sources for yourself. The works of one Flavius Josephus, the source upon which so many other narratives are derived from, doesn't back up the New Testament claims at all. He has a few verses on a character named John the Baptist, whom he claims died under entirely different circumstances than the various Gospels claim, and one verse on Jesus, which many scholars point out bears evidence of being a later insertion into the text of Josephus. The other odd little bits and pieces you may find are conflicting, obscure, typically cryptic, and therefore anything but conclusive. And before you have the urge to cry, that's just the establishment trying to cover up the truth of the New Testament, remember it's you who wanted to use those same establishment sources a minute ago to prove the veracity of the New Testament. So which is it? Is the establishment trustworthy or untrustworthy? If you can trust the establishment to honestly preserve Christian records, then that's a big problem for your persecution narrative. And if you can't trust them, that's a big problem when it comes to verifying the New Testament. The simple fact is, if you're honest, the only so-called Christian persecution you've ever witnessed has been in the pages of unverifiable books, movies, and stories, or from Christian institutions and missionaries who greatly benefit via all the donations they receive from trusting Western Christians. You've never actually seen or experienced Christian persecution because it doesn't exist. A studious young boy is more likely to be persecuted by his inner-city classmates than any Christian anywhere for their faith. And why would anyone want to persecute any Christian anyways? Christians are utterly harmless, except to their families and friends who they are usually very unchristian towards. Oh yes, and towards former Christians who insist on using logic, facts, and the Bible itself to disprove the claims of Christianity. Towards these people, the Christian is typically vicious. Christians are, however, a domineering government's wet dream. Do you really think Caesar, if there ever really were a Caesar in Rome, would care who you called God as long as you were paying your taxes? Governments love Christians because they pose zero threat. This is why churches and Christian schools and institutions are so well treated by all the governments you and I know of and can personally verify. And most people are totally fine with Christians. What they aren't fine with is assholes who float around acting better than them, Christian and atheist alike. So it's about time we grew up and admitted that Christian persecution is nothing more than a myth perpetuated to keep Christians believing and practicing Christianity, to keep the slave class idolizing and adoring Jesus and the God-making Trinity. And when myths have to be created in order to keep the faith and practice of any religion strong, you have to wonder why this is. If it were honestly admitted by Christians and their institutions that, in reality, Christianity is extraordinarily large, strong, and wealthy, and has been such for all verifiable memory, don't you think that might start to affect the way many slave-class Christians looked at this oppressive religious regime? Don't you think it's at least a good possibility that a number of these slaves might begin to wonder why the Old Testament law has so many here and now promises of blessings, whereas Christianity only has a hereafter maybe? Do you think some might begin to wonder if the substance of their here and now reality is being wasted and used by the same institution creating myths out of thin air? Do you think it's possible these slaves might then realize that the only tangible, provable persecution is that perpetrated by the church and Christians against them when they begin to question or leave Christianity? The truly brave soul is the one who rejects Christianity, and not out of emotion or selfishness, but by way of rational consideration of the facts. That is the soul that will experience true persecution, and at the hands of those they believed were their friends and family. Don't believe me? Step out and give it a try. No one need contrive myths about that persecution. Until next time, for the Obry Project, I'm John Machtemes. Please consider traveling this strange reality with me by becoming a member here on YouTube, a patron at Patreon, or purchasing goods or services now available and coming soon from the Obry Project. Thank you.